because of how we learn to draw as kids and because of the sorts of drawings we look at often as children, either cartoons or very simplified drawings in children's storybooks, it's easy to think that when we draw, we're basically trying to copy something by outlining what we're looking at as accurately as possible. And look, for some ways of drawing, for some styles, for some subjects, this can work quite well. But when we go to draw a broader range of things, we often end up discovering that our drawings aren't looking as realistic as we would like, that we're not capturing a real sense of what's happening. There's an oversimplification or a cartoon-looking quality that comes into our work. And what we often don't realize is that it's because of this way of understanding drawing as using lines to create shapes that we see. Because so many scenes, or at least objects in the scenes that we're drawing, simply don't translate into lines well at all, simply don't translate into shapes that can be enclosed or outlined. And a scene such as this Australian bush scene, certainly captures many of those subjects and many of those dilemmas when we start to look at all the detail that we can see in a photo. What do we do? If lines aren't a great way of thinking, a great technique of drawing, what's better? I found that when I stopped thinking about lines and began to think about marks, that this opened up my thinking, released my thinking to allow more variability in the process of drawing and how I actually drew. When I began to think of marks, somehow I found it easier now to find the best way of putting the ink on the paper to create the sort of scene I wanted. So look at what I'm doing now. This is what I call mark making with my paper, or with my pen, with my ink on the paper. It's putting a series of, ink marks on the paper. Now, some of them you could certainly describe as small lines, and some of them approximately enclosed shapes. Now, if you look at these clusters of leaves that I'm drawing now, you can see that some of them, I've basically got two sides of a leaf, albeit they're small lines, but in other parts, I'm not drawing them precisely. I'm not outlining precisely. I'm more bundling a whole bunch of marks together that create the look of what we're looking at in our reference. And when you look at this trunk, this tree trunk, now this trunk is the major subject in our drawing. It's from top to bottom. It's probably, in general terms, the cleanest shape, and it's got two approximately straight lines down each side. And if I'm thinking line making, drawing by outlining shapes, I would have been tempted to have done basically two continuous lines, one for each side, at the very start. And instead, if you think back to what I did, or maybe you might want to zip back and have another look at it, I did a series of dash lines going down. So really a series of joined marks that weren't exactly straight and weren't trying to be. Because when I look at my actual subject, yes, approximately, compared to a lot of other things on this paper, in this photo, it's more or less two straight lines. But in fact, it's a series of curved places that bulge outwards, inwards, that have a little disruption, where maybe a branch once came off and has been long since snapped off, where a bit of bark is hanging loose. And so I want to put marks on my paper that, while I'm not trying to exactly draw all of those little ins and outs and details down the silhouette edge of the trunk, I certainly want to find some marks that capture the effect of that visually give that same feel, because a smooth straight line, or even a smooth line, even if it's not completely straight, is going to create a very different feel. It's going to feel more like a metal pipe than the bark of a tree. And you can see now that with my mark making for these leaves, again, how do we draw leaves? The problem with understanding the drawing process as outlining shapes and trying to outline them as accurately as we can for what we see is that, well, it's just impossible. There's too many leaves, even if we can see them all. But of course, leaves can very easily reach the point where it's just a mass of individual leaves that we can no longer see. We see the mass, we can't see the individual leaves. And so, again, outlining leaves is not very good, but having an understanding of the drawing process that I'm trying to capture the overall effect of what I'm seeing is really helpful, because now I might well draw with lines. And in this scene, you can see that I do have some short lines here and there for different parts. But lines become one of my options of mark making. Lines become one of the ink tools that I have. But I'm not thinking lines. And when I think of lines, focus on lines, I am very much often thinking of outline, whereas I don't want to do that. I want to be thinking of marks of lines as marks among many. And so now when I'm looking at my reference, I'm not looking at outlines most of the time. I'm looking at the overall effect of what I'm seeing in my reference first, and then I'm thinking, how can I splash, inscribe, put ink on the paper that's going to translate what I'm seeing in my photo into a drawing. And you can see now what I'm doing. And while I've got, I guess what I'm trying to do with this tree at the very left is I'm trying to give a sense of part of it goes back behind the other part, the closer part, the left-hand trunk sort of has the right-hand trunk in front of it as the tree branches upwards and twists from this viewpoint. So how do I find marks to capture that? See, it's not by doing outlining. It's often by creating volume. No, it's not by creating volume. It's often by creating value instead. So I'm not looking at shapes to outline. I'm looking at areas of darkness and lightness and of mid-values in my reference that are caused by certain things, that are caused by the sun direction, the color originally of the object, by what's around it and cast in shadow, that create certain depths of darkness. And so I'm trying to capture those as well. And I can't capture darkness by outlining anything, but I can capture it by hatching or by putting a series of marks close together that deposit a lot of ink on the paper close together. And by using different marks, by overlapping them in different ways, I can create different types of darknesses. And this is what I want to do to create the overall impression, the overall effect that we have in this photo, in this scene. And so you can see me now, I'm in a more well-lit part of my reference. And so in lots of ways, I feel like I don't need to use many marks at all, although it's an incredibly complex scene. The overall effect of the sunlight striking that plant, that yellowy green plant in the lower left corner, really just lights up everything at once. And so we tend to lose the detail. We have to look hard to see it in the photo, although we can. And so I want to create that effect. I don't need to start drawing any of those tiny leaves, well-lit leaves, because, well, if I do that, I'm going to be putting so much ink on the paper trying to outline little shapes that all we're going to see is black, when the effect in our reference is a very light value. So I want to leave a fairly reasonable size area of light value there, and I want the edges of that light value, and we're going to mostly see this light value because of darker values that are around it, that are behind it. I'm going to see it as a whole. I'm going to see it as a bush. I'm not a little shrub. I'm not going to see it as individual parts. Whereas some of these larger things, some of the larger shrubs and trees, I will get a sense of individual parts of leaves of whatnot. And you can see here now I'm in a sense the leaves of this close central bush or small tree. No, I think it's a bush. Are really drawn in inverted commas not by the outlines I did, but by the darkness behind. I really only just did those outlines so that when I did the shading behind, I would leave the white paper that would establish those. And we look at what I'm drawing now, which is another fairly large shrub, but it's definitely not a tree, in the sort of centre background that's being shadowed by something off to the right that we can't see. And so it's a much darker value than it would otherwise have. And again, I'm just trying to draw the expanse, find marks to create this expansive darker value for this. Now, when we start to move to the right-hand side, we probably have the most complex area where we have some trees that are very close, some wattle-type trees, I think, that are very close, that have a yellowy green fine leaf. And so you can see the marks I've done there to try and start to get the feel of that foliage, the feel of what we see, not the detail of it, but of what we see. And with plants, a really important part of that is the direction of the growth and the way the growth sits on the branch and the way the leaves connect with each other, particularly if there are lots of smaller leaves bound into a, in effect, larger leaf. All of this affects the appearance overall and the way it captures the light. So I want to have some marks that sort of reflect that. But then around it, we have another tree that has quite discernible leaves. It's a bit further back. It's also in a lot of darkness. And we see some of those leaves silhouetted as darkness, whereas we see some of these closer leaves silhouetted in light. And it creates this quite complex patterns of lights and darks, lights and darks. And I find the best way to try and draw this is to find marks to create these patterns of light and dark. Now, I've also got to be aware of how light and dark I make them, how many layers of marks I put on top of each other in relation to the other values in the scene. So when we look at this, the darkest values, though, are in the center and in the center left, not these right-hand ones. So these are all things that lead me to continuously say in these videos, we don't want to try and do our final darknesses too early because we want to be able to adjust overall, which means we need to leave room to go darker in some places. Once I've basically colored in all the paper, I can't, with the ink, regardless of what marks I use, I can't go any darker there. So if I want to be able to make a darker area darker at the end to just tweak the overall read of the scene, I have to leave the capacity to do that by having some white paper that I can still make darker. So caution at this stage. Now I am using a series of pens with this, possibly even a 0.5, but certainly a 0.3, 0.2 and 0.1 Copic multi-liner. And so I suspect I've just swapped from a 3 to a 2 at this point. But we can also vary the intensity of our line, the width of it and the thickness and the darkness of it by the pressure we put on and by the angle we hold it to the paper. The paper we use also affects our capacity. This is why it's good to use the same materials over and over again, regardless of what they are. Because if I use the same materials, the same paper, the same pens, I get to explore the parameters, the extremes of how they can be used. And then I can use that deliberately to increase the number of effects I can create to, if I can change the way the ink goes on the paper, then I have more options when I'm looking at something thinking, how on earth from this photo am I going to translate this into marks on my paper? So you can see now how I'm actually building up by layering on top of each other and next to each other different marks, I'm creating the feel, the effect of the complex scene that I'm seeing now. And it's because I'm thinking marks, I'm not thinking lines to outline. Now, obviously, in some parts of this scene, some of the branches, particularly the closer ones, I might get a line that's an inch or two long, or even just a centimetre in length, before I have to stop it because another line is moving behind. And this is another thing, when I'm thinking marks and not lines, I'm less likely to commit that, I think, error when we're drawing trees such as this, where branches are overlapping each other, going back in depth, that we just draw them all over each other. And look, it might be that they're all in shadow and so they're all dark and we think it doesn't matter. And in a sense, visually, in some ways, it may look the same as the photo. But the problem with photos is that they compress depth. We don't see three-dimensionally. Everything is very flat. And what I want to do in my drawing is put back in the weakness of the photo, to put back the sense of three dimensions. And by not drawing all my tree branches through each other, see what I'm doing now? It gives a sense of there's definitely something in front and something behind. And that also helps to create the reality of how any forest woodland, but the Australian bush scene looks, where there's incredible depth going back of busyness. But I'm looking at my reference and thinking, what am I seeing? And I'm really seeing it in terms of blurs of values and of edges of silhouettes. And I'm seeking to create them. But I'm also, as I look at my reference, I'm being aware of trying to work out the depth better than the photo shows, because the photo doesn't show the depth very well. And look how I'm changing my marks now for this tree, which is further away than the tree I did that was closer. Much less detail, because I can't see as much detail. So I want to have the way I draw this tree look very different to that first tree. Look how this closest tree, I've actually got some of the bark texture indicated. The way the bark is capturing the shadow. I haven't done that for the trees further back because it's not nearly as obvious. Now, if I look hard in my photo, I can see bark texture for some of those further back trees. But if I put any more marks on some of those, if you like, whiter trunks of the closer trees, then they're going to blend into the surrounding bushland too much. And so that won't help me understand the meaning. I control my marks always so that the visual meaning of my reference is reproduced in some way in my drawing. You can see how in my thinking, I'm not trying to be copying the things that are in this scene. I'm trying to create the same effect. I'm trying to translate a photo language into a black fine liner ink marks language. So I'm trying to find marks that will say something similar, but quite possibly in a different way. So what I'm doing right now, these marks I'm using for the far distant ridgeline that we see, if I look at the ridgeline is, well, it's tree canopies, and we can see them like little rounded broccoli tops, very pale in the far distance. But I've just used a series of vertical lines, very faint ones, that I haven't taken down as far as we can see it in the photo. I've left a bit of a gap there before we hit a little halo effect, before we've hit the layer of value, which in effect is some closer trees, much closer trees underneath. And so this horizontal kind of breathing space that I leave is to try not to over-organize visually the space we're looking at, but to give some help to not get totally lost in all these marks. I have to establish some pathways where anyone looking at this, where their brain can kind of just pause and see a little bit of separation. Because one thing that creates separation of different subjects in my reference, of course, is color. Sometimes it's the different greens or yellowy greens and paler greens that that help indicate what's what. And obviously I don't get that with ink on paper. I have the challenge of black and white. Now I have, I think, also the beauty of black and white and the crispness of black and white, but it's another way that when I translate the drawing, the photo, into a drawing, it's very early here, when I translate the photo into a drawing, it's another way I have to change. I have to translate visually from what I'm seeing using marks on paper, using the language I have, my drawing language. And obviously, if I wanted to add some watercolor onto this at some stage, if I knew I was going to do that, then that would affect the marks I'm putting on the paper, because I don't have to establish the entire scene with this language. I'm going to have another language, a color language to combine, and that will give me options of how I do things. So it is important to understand all the tools I'm going to have at my disposal, all the options for drawing process before I start. And you can see now at this right-hand side, I'm just trying to work out as we come into the later minutes of this drawing. Can I say, please hit the like button if you haven't already, if you're finding this helpful. And you're watching this at time and a half. So you can use the settings icon, that cog icon, and you can make this slower if you want to see me draw it at actual drawing speed. Or for that matter, you can speed bits up if you want to get to the end and see how it looks. But please hit that like button for me before you do that. And look what I'm doing here. I'm actually establishing some little trunks with negative spacing. I've drawn the darkness behind them so that we can see them and they don't get lost. And drawing with negative space, so I'm not drawing the object, I'm just drawing the darkness behind that surrounds the object, is an incredibly effective way in these sorts of scenes. And if you have a good look at this drawing when it's finished, find all the places where I've really drawn more by negative space. But let's have a look on the the left-hand side, sorry. That tree that I spoke about earlier that kind of forks and twists around itself. Just have a look at the ground level where I've done the marks, the hatching marks for the shadow, or it's actually also probably shadow and a bit of bushfire blackening. Notice I've changed direction. I've done those marks horizontally because that makes them stand out against the vertical marks that are behind it, representing the foliage. So it's not just the marks we put on the paper, but it's the direction that we put them, because direction can really add clarity to what we're drawing, or it can add confusion. So always consider, particularly when I'm layering marks over the top of other marks, think hard first about what's going to make it easier to see the thing that I'm trying to create by adding these marks. But when I began to think about marks rather than lines, it helped me focus on creating effects rather than outlining shapes. And suddenly there was this three-dimensionality appearing in my drawing, and there was this incredibly increasing opportunity to create really interesting effects that I didn't think it was possible to draw with a pen before. And that meant suddenly there were far more subjects that I could draw, or subjects that I could draw well, or subjects that could be a part of a drawing and not somehow make the overall drawing look less realistic. Suddenly I found I had so many more options when I stopped thinking about lines, drawing with lines, and thought of drawing with marks. And so lines simply became one of the types of marks I could use. And I stopped thinking of shapes and I began thinking of effects. Now, sometimes there'll be a very clear shape and it will be very geometric in our reference, and it's going to be very geometric and smooth-edged in our drawing. It might be a modern sculpture in a streetscape. And of course, that's fine if outlining a shape works well. And sometimes this works well when we draw cars as well, at least when we're blocking out the car. If outlining a shape is the best way to capture an effect, then absolutely. But generally, life is more complex. And generally, thinking marks has been incredibly liberating in letting me widen the things I can draw, the effectiveness I can draw them with, and simply developing an understanding of my drawing process far more deeply. And that frees me up to draw better. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. Hope you found this interesting. Great little scene. I'll post this photo on my post page, so if you want to have a go drawing this yourself, why not? I suggest you don't copy it from my drawing, but you watch my drawing, you take in what I'm saying, and then you have a go drawing this scene without looking at my drawing, and then you compare it with my drawing and just see the different choices we made. This is how we learn. Copying doesn't give us understanding, so it's generally not the best way to learn. But hey, however you do it, however it turns out, and whether you draw with lines or marks, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.